The biggest advantage of physical strength is that you never actually have to use it. The best way to play a war is to not having to participate in it. You have a very complex system that, to the outside, appears as very sophisticated and very well thought through. It is usually very fragile in the inside, and the more variables you have, the less predictable it becomes, especially if you're artificially suppressing volatility.
My question is, who benefited from globalization in the past? And do you think that was a narrative that was pushed?
I do appreciate the opportunity we have here now, that is to rethink the global trade order, and where we have neglected even considering potential side effects and negative consequences.
If you have a functioning small organization, aka family, where both partners work, why aren't they able to afford a nice house? That should be the least thing that should be possible.
Seeing all of these asset indices crashing down a little more, you suddenly weaken that disproportionately strong consumer class of the upper couple of percent, which do not constitute the majority of the United States population and not the majority of the voting population.
Max, what's going on?
Good morning, Onur. I am ecstatic. There's a lot going on. I don't know where to start, where to end this, but let's try to make sense of this whole situation. The S&P and the Nasdaq have just seen the 5 deviation session move yesterday after the tariffs got put on a 90-day hold, which is extremely unlikely to happen. If you look up what percentage odds are a 5th deviation move, it is insane. These indices were trading like some crypto meme coins throughout the last hours of the US session yesterday. So there's a lot going on, a lot of volatility. Being short vol is the only trade that is certainly going to be wrong within the next couple of years, and has been wrong throughout the last couple of years, ever since COVID happened. A couple of observations we've made, themes we've discussed in our first episode about macro, are now starting to unfold, or are at least intensifying. So yeah, where do you want to start, Onur?
Okay, so I am a little ignorant to this topic. What I've perceived on X was basically Trump started implementing tariffs. That led to a lot of fear, FUD in the markets. And I've seen the S&P 500 tank. And I think 2.5 trillion was wiped out of the market as a result. Then I've seen a fake tweet where the tariffs are on hold, which added billions to the markets again, and then they tanked again. And then, as you described, this 90-day pause. So the volatility is insane. Have not seen anything like that before. Other than that, I'm fairly uneducated on all the details. I guess what I would like to start with is, what was China's reaction? And do you know how the world perceives what Trump is doing?
China is one of the first ones that retaliated. The general tariffs that got imposed on April 2nd. Just for the context of our listeners, we are recording this on April 10th. So by the time we put it out, we don't know what will have happened next, because it seems like the macro outlook for the next couple of years is turning around every couple of hours now. Be that as it may, China retaliated. They were already hit by higher tariffs. They started the trade war in 2016 during the first Trump term, when he started imposing tariffs on China. I think it was 20% back then. Biden upheld them largely. Now the entire conflict intensified with additional tariffs on China. So China retaliated. And later in the episode, where we will discuss the potential objectives that Trump is trying to achieve with these tariffs, China will play a pretty large role there. Nevertheless, a couple of other countries have rushed to negotiation. For example, Zimbabwe, which is one of the less important trading partners of the US, but who still has a large incentive to get tariffs down to zero. Some others, there have been some words of caution from the EU, but there's also been a push to retaliate with tariffs there. So the sentiment has been very mixed. However, the smarter countries among us. Let's take Singapore, for example, which generally has a very thought through public opinion on things of global matter. I've watched a talk by the Prime Minister of Singapore a couple of hours ago, which I found very interesting. And he is highly convinced that the previous global order of, by default, global cooperation and global trade is over. This somewhat relates to the topic that we touched upon in our first episode, where we said, okay, it is very likely that globalization, just for the sake of globalization, has peaked, and that we are back to a regime of interest-driven foreign policy, and that the value-driven foreign policy that we have perceived from 1990 until 2020 was largely an illusion, in the sense that it is pretentious to assume that these countries don't have interests anymore for their own, and that they will just pursue that idealistic version of everybody's friends and kumbaya while neglecting the interests of their own voter base. For example, people working in manufacturing jobs and generally the blue collar population.
My question is, who benefited from globalization in the past? And do you think that was a narrative that was pushed? I do agree that we're clearly seeing a change in not foreign policy, but basically tariffs is the best example, right? We're seeing a change in how globalization versus localization is being perceived worldwide. We're seeing a shift politically to the right, conservative, worldwide. And I think these are all signs that sovereign nation states and the people of those nation states, they care more about strengthening their own local nation and communities rather than this idea of the perfect globalized world. So, coming back, my question is, why do you think globalization happened in the first place, and who benefited from that? And what is your outlook with regards to the state of global trade if we're seeing the change with tariffs and whatnot?
To answer the first part, everybody has benefited of globalization in the large scheme of things. Second and third world nations were able to build their economies because they have access to resources, commodities, and cheap manual labor. So they were primarily involved in these less sophisticated and initial steps of manufacturing goods. And they were able to export it to richer countries in the first world, in Europe and the United States. So they were getting money from wealthy countries for goods that they would not have been able to sell within their domestic economies. And the first world nations were able to profit from a very cheap access to goods from the second and third world. If you look at the entire developing world, Southeast Asia until a couple of decades ago, and some of these countries still are in that developing stage. If you look at Africa, which is still largely stuck in the developing age, South America and Latin America, which is somewhere in between. Without globalization, none of that wealth creation, none of the increase in the quality of life, in the life expectancy would have happened to a comparable scale. The economics 101 assumption of free trade is good is 100% correct. If there's a free exchange of goods and services between two contending parties, which is mutually beneficial, everybody's going to profit. Be that as it may, of course, globalization has side effects, and the side effects primarily hit the less qualified, less flexible, blue collar working class and manufacturing workers in the first world nations. Because over time, with global trade dynamics rising and becoming more efficient, they were less needed because they were a version of the same good, of the same quality, but for a higher hourly wage. Let's take the automotive industry as an example. I think we can relate to that very well as living in Germany. And it's also been a big industry in the United States. And cars in the past, because they were rather large goods, they were not as easy to import and export as, for example, avocados, which are bound to only grow in a certain climate, or specialized lighter goods, fabrics, for example, which you can import and export across the globe at much less weight and much less complexity relative to the value of the goods as, for example, a car. And with cars, you also had technical capabilities and competencies that you had to establish in these third world nations, so it made sense to produce them there. Whereas now, the Chinese car industry has caught up tremendously over the past couple of years. They have access to cheaper inputs. They are heavily subsidized by the Chinese state. So you get a good of equal, if not better quality, for a fraction of the price. There is no rational reason to keep producing cars in Germany or the United States. Of course, you have switching costs of like setting up factories in China, winding them down in the US or Germany. These are variables to consider. But in the grand scheme of things, there is no economic rationale in staying loyal to any country of production. So in these countries of production, where you previously had large manufacturing plants, what are you going to do with the people who work there? Especially in the past, manufacturing has been very labor intensive, so you needed a lot of people in these plants, and these plants have given jobs to tens of thousands at a time for a single plant. And now all of these people have become obsolete. And the people who work there were usually not the highest educated, and it is much harder to train somebody for something else if they don't have all of these educational requirements already in place. As, for example, you can do with white collar jobs, which are more interchangeable. You just move to another company to a slightly different function. So, whereas it was very easy for our parents and grandparents' generation to build up a very stable, a very decent life, feed a family of four on the income of one in Germany, that is no longer possible. And you notice that in the US, and you notice that in Europe, and in every other first world nation. So these people, they still have a right to vote, and they have the opportunity to express their opinion politically. So they are obviously angry with the current state of things. And if you look at the development of the financial markets, they have been additionally harmed by that because they have less access to the asset economy than people who are already wealthy. In the past, the American dream was if you work hard, if you make something out of yourself, you can become very wealthy, you can do well on your own. Your own fate is in your hand. Everybody's playing by the same rules. With the financialization of everything, that was no longer the case because if you look at all of these macro concepts, for example, the Cantillon effect, and many of these concepts we can dive deeper into in a later episode, the people who are closer to the money printer will profit disproportionately more by quantitative easing and more monetary inflation compared to the people who own less assets, maybe have a house that they inherited from their grandparents, but that's pretty much it. And if you look at everything that has unfolded ever since the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, the asset owners have pro- profited disproportionately. All of these working class people, it has become harder and harder to move up the economic ranks of these first world countries. So they are the ones who have gotten hurt. And now they are excitedly waiting for something to turn around.
There's a lot to unpack there. I just would like to comment on one thing that resonated a lot. In my peer group and amongst my family and friends, one thing I keep hearing is an average income or even above average income household with both parents working at an above average income and two kids. It is very hard for them to afford a home, a house. And that is a problem. And that is kind of a mutually agreed statement in many places in the world where if you have a functioning small organization, aka family, where both partners work, why aren't they able to afford a nice house? That should be the least thing that should be possible before. Now, obviously, there's a lot of factors that lead to the fact that it's not possible, or it is very, very hard, and people go into debt for decades. Even if they are willing to spend half a lifetime in debt, they still can't afford it just because of the explosion in prices. So, what do you think is the strategy here? And coming back to tariffs, in your opinion, how does success look like with this?
To briefly touch upon the real estate market, it's not as affected by the whole tariff situation and the developments we are seeing right now, but of course it is one of these additional symptoms in the macroeconomic landscape that we're dealing with. And in the first world nations, Germany, US, etc., the real estate market is probably the single industry that is propped up politically the most. You have a very large incentive, given that in most of these nations, the boomer generation and Generation X is making up the majority of the voters to politically cater to them. So there is an incentive in place to hinder the building of new homes that all of these older people who have the majority of their net worth and also their retirement savings in these homes, the asset prices of these homes are artificially inflated. They feel rich, they can consume, and these people are, in the short term, the most exploitable consumers because they have high medical bills, they spend time on vacation, and they stimulate the economy because they are part of the less informed consumers compared to the younger generations who have grown up with all of these technologies with more access to information and with better skills to navigate them. In the mid to long run, it is the exact opposite. In the mid to long run, if you want to ensure growth, sustainable growth of your economy, you want to optimize for the younger generations. It's very easy to understand that, okay, if you have kids, there is an additional contributor to the economy and there is an additional consumer. So that is net positive. However, the problem with many of these first world nation democracies is that the default time horizon for political decisions never exceeds 4 to 5 years. It is capped at one iteration of the next election. That is a huge incentive misalignment, and now we are seeing the consequences of that building up over the last couple of decades.
What's the goal, you think, with the new direction and policy we're seeing?
There are two theories out there. One theory, which we primarily see from media that is already opposed to the Trump persona and Trump policies and everything that he and the current US administration stand for, there the assumption is, yeah, it is just pure stupidity. There is no thought, no strategy into all of this. Whereas this is a possibility, I think the path of reason to come to that conclusion is pretty weak because suddenly you have all of these people who were crying from the roofs about free trade agreements in the past are suddenly advocating against tariffs and for free trade, which is fairly hypocritical and rather self-righteous when founded in good arguments. Then you can go sort of a middle way is we don't know how much thought has flown into this. If you look back, I think it is already 40 years ago, where Trump in an interview has talked about the US trade deficits and how he is holding very positive views of tariffs. Then you have some of his advisors, for example, Peter Navarro. If you listen to him, he seems to be genuinely convinced that a trade deficit for the US is a terrible thing and that they must get to a trade balance, which I think is not very reasonable, and there is no worth in attaining that. Just to spend a brief minute on the trade deficits, the situation the United States is in, they have the largest consumer base measured in spending power on the globe. They are having the world reserve currency with the US dollar. They're the only ones who can, in theory, print a lot of money without the US dollar devaluing correspondingly. For them, it makes sense to run a trade deficit because most of the global trade is conducted in the US dollar. You can print, in theory, unlimited amount of this resource, and you can use it to acquire cheap goods from everywhere else in the world. So your consumers profit, and on the same side, the US trade deficit is often exaggerated because the only side of a coin that is being looked at is the trade deficit in goods, but not the trade balance or deficit in services. If you look at services, for example, the entire software as a service industry, the US is the leading hub for all of that, and it is exporting it into the entire world. Think about companies like Google, Microsoft, Meta. Most of these things are coming from the US. So the whole trade deficit discussion doesn't make too much sense there, in my opinion. Or at least I don't see the merit of trying to balance it necessarily. If you look at some of these nations, take Vietnam, they have a consumer base with very low purchasing power. And on the other hand, they are able to cheaply offer goods to the United States because the costs for manual labor there are way cheaper. There is no reason that I can think of why countries like Vietnam should have a trade balance with the United States. So that's on the trade balance and trade deficit side of things.
What is the official stance of the Trump administration? Do they want to get to a trade balance, or are they fine staying in a deficit?
There's no 100% clear indication of where they want to go. Some of the administration's members, for example, Elon Musk, he is very pro free trade in general. Others, like Peter Navarro, are very much against free trade in the case of it causing a trade imbalance to the United States. Trump himself, he's been talking about the deficits for the last 40 years. There is a case to be made that these deficits, especially in the manufacturing goods and these first orders of processing, do hurt the American working class, but everything comes at a cost. There's no solution. There's just a trade-off of different problems. If you want to boost the domestic economy of manufacturing, it will probably come at the cost of having to pay more for certain other consumer goods if you're not importing them from countries anymore where they could be produced more cheaply. In the end, you need to weigh your priorities there as a nation. Another benefit of reshoring some industries is that in a more autark scenario, you have more stability if it comes to geopolitical tensions because you're not dependent on other nations to import essential goods, especially agriculture, defense, and basic machinery. These are, given the geopolitical tensions we are living in right now, these are industry where it makes sense to reshore them. That is also leading over to the other viewpoint where some people say Trump is playing 3D chess here. I don't know if it is 3D chess, but I do think it is worth taking a look at the grand scheme of things goals that he wants to achieve during his administration. First of all, he obviously does not want to spike inflation again. Tariffs by nature are inflationary if all other things stay equal because it is a consumption tax. To cancel out the inflation in terms of you have less spending power relative to your income, you would have to couple imposing tariffs with reducing income taxes, which might be a good option in the case of the United States because the US is the only power in the world where most other nations still have a large enough incentive to import to them because they have the largest consumer base there.
Yeah.
So they would probably be willing to settle on a compromise where the US consumer doesn't bear 100% of these price increases. That coupled with lower income tax could be beneficial for the average US consumer.
If you look at crazy periods of inflation, one thing I've realized the other day when researching a little bit was it wasn't necessarily that the printing of money was causing inflation. It was more so that scarcity and supply is the biggest issue, right? And don't you think that with introduction or increasing of tariffs and the supply shock, don't you think that that is the biggest problem with regards to inflation?
I don't think that a 10% tariff across the board is going to cause hyperinflation.
We're at 125% now.
That is only on China. And China makes up, I think, around 15% of US imports. If you consider what are they importing, is it essential goods that people have to buy? Are they importing houses? Are they importing fighter jets? Are they importing corn? No, they're not. They're mostly importing some tech goods and some rather useless consumer goods, to put a little bit of judgment on there. If you think about it on a
The iPhone?
very zoomed out manner, getting this consumerism for the sake of consumerism down in the United States would be a tremendous benefit for the world. If you think about the development of the United States population, sustainability, and all of these things. So in general, I'm not a pro-tariff person, genuinely believe in the advantage of free trade, but I do appreciate the opportunity we have here now, that is to rethink the global trade order that we have embarked on over the last couple of decades, and where we have neglected even considering potential side effects and negative consequences. This forces us to reconsider and maybe realign ourselves. Come back to Trump's potential objectives here. One is to keep inflation low. That is obviously going to be challenging if you assume that everything else is going to stay equal, but now you have tariffs. You'd have to counter that, for example, with a reduction in taxes. Then he wants lower interest rates, economic uncertainty, while unemployment is still very low in the United States, obviously gives more leeway to the Federal Reserve. What I have heard is that Jerome Powell is actually very aware of the fact that over the past 15 years and also the decades before, consumption has been increasingly driven by the upper percentiles of asset owners and the economic class in the United States, and that he would be interested in fixing that imbalance and that disproportionate distribution. You can think of it like a K distribution. You have an ever decreasing in the number of people upper share of the economic class, and an ever increasing in the number of people but ever weaker share of the lower class. The wealth inequality is rising, and it is not due to capitalism being unfair or everything, but the access of capital being unfair and the access to assets being unfair, if you want to put that judgment to it. Powell may have an incentive to hold off with lowering rates, because by not lowering rates and now seeing all of these asset indices crashing down a little more, you suddenly weaken that disproportionately strong consumer class of the upper couple of percent, which do not constitute the majority of the United States population and not the majority of the voting population. So that is going to be an interesting thing to observe here. I do think in the end, rates will be lowered over a long enough time horizon. QE is inevitable. We've discussed that in the previous episodes. So lower rates are the second objective next to inflation. He also wants to get the 10-year yields down of the 10-year government bonds, because that makes it easier for the US government to refinance their debt. The rates have been pretty volatile over the last couple of days. Until 3 or 4 days ago, their plan went pretty well. 10-year rates have been decreasing, but now over the past 2 to 3 days, they have been spiking up again. So that is also not going super well. Then you have the entire perception of, okay, I'm doing this for the working class, irrespective of whether it is actually helping the working class. It is more about the perception. Who is Trump optimizing for? And I think that is going reasonably well. Many people in the US manufacturing sector are at least neutral, if not positive, about it. Small business owners who are dependent on imports from cheaper countries are obviously not as amused by this development, but again, the typical blue collar worker is reasonably happy. These are the economic objectives of Trump. What I think, in the grand scheme of things, is much more interesting to pay attention to is the geopolitical side of things.
You've described a few short-term outcomes during Trump's second administration, and they don't necessarily look good. They are counter to what he promised. What is your outlook? How do you think success looks like for Trump with everything he's doing, especially with regards to the tariff strategy?
That culminates in the geopolitical angle, because I don't think that these tariffs are a measure he wants to use for economic purposes, or at least the economic purpose is only a means to an end. If you look at the Western world right now, the West has weakened tremendously over the past 10 to 15 years. Ever since the global financial crisis, our financial system has become more fragile, if you are a fan of Nassim Taleb, one of the basic takeaways there, and there's a bunch of stuff to disagree with him about, but one of the basic takeaways, which I think is very useful, is that if you have a very complex system that to the outside appears as very sophisticated and very well thought through, it is usually very fragile in the inside. And the more variables you have, the less predictable it becomes, especially if you're artificially suppressing volatility. And that is what we have done macroeconomically over the past couple of decades by trying to smooth out natural volatility through monetary and interest rates interventions from central banks. So that is all coming home now. What would success look like? If there is a strategy, which I don't know whether there is, it is that Trump wants to reshore all of these essential industry in every Western nation. Why would he want to do that? What is the goal there? The current geopolitical situation in the West. We have, with China, a big ideological competitor. The Chinese government deeply believes in a totalitarian and controlling regime where you have a form of state capitalism, which is diametrically opposed to the free West. That wouldn't be an issue to us if we can rely on this Chinese model staying isolated to China. The problem with collectivist types of administrations is, combined with the current demographical outlook in China, is that these types of administrations are inherently parasitic. So they need to expand. And there is a big risk that China is going to have to expand militarily over the next couple of decades to uphold their current position and strengthen it. So that is a risk we have to hedge as the West. I am deeply convinced that the best way to prevent any kinetic war is deterrence. If you look at just us two, we are both at least trying to be on the more well-built side physically of the population. Why do we do that? Why do we do strength training and work out? To deter other people from attacking us if it comes to shove to shove. It's a very basic evolutionary mechanism there. Um, the biggest advantage of physical strength is that you never actually have to use it. The best way to play a war is to not having to participate in it. Assuming that there is an end goal in all of this, and this is not just pure chaos, which it very well could be. I don't know that. But assuming that there is an end goal, the end goal would be that you reshore all of these essential industries and you get to a state where every single Western nation is strong enough to defend itself. One of the big critiques that Trump has voiced over the last months is that Europe is not willing to pay and stand up for its own security. And he is 100% right with that. We cannot blindly rely on NATO. We need to strengthen ourselves to an extent where we are able to defend ourselves. And ideally, it doesn't even come to that state, but we are perceived as so strong that nobody's even going to attack us. By reducing the blind reliance on global trade and the global kumbaya, you at least give every nation the opportunity to strengthen itself from the inside. If there is that large scale strategic gamble, I think that would be it. But that assumes that Trump is still thinking about the West as a geopolitical union. Because in the end, he wants to keep all of these people as allies. And I don't think that in the mid to long run, it is positive EV for him to uphold any of these tariffs vis-a-vis his allies. I don't think it makes sense to uphold them against the entire EU. I don't think it makes sense to uphold them against Mexico, against Canada, against Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Australia, and many of these other nations, which, at least in theory, are aligned and have been aligned with the United States for the past 5 decades, ever since the Cold War. The two objectives you have here is that you want to deter China economically and don't even make them think about attacking Taiwan or any other Western ally. And also show Russia that, okay, try to do whatever with the Ukraine, but if you go one step further, you'll be the one who loses. You want to increase deterrence there again. Now, the risk you have is, in the short run, the West is fractured and torn apart. There's no response in unison. We don't know, is this just a negotiation tactic or is Trump actually trying to impose tariffs on us in the mid to long run? So we don't know how to respond, and we don't know if we can take the US as a granted ally anymore, both geopolitically and economically. Right now, the West is even more weakened and more fractured than it was before the tariffs. The biggest risk to this not becoming a success, but becoming a blatant failure in not only economic terms, but more in geopolitical terms, is that we would now face a two-front war. And I don't necessarily mean war in a kinetic sense. We don't have a direct kinetic war with Russia. We are intervening there. They are having foreign support on their side as well. So it's a quasi-kinetic war, which in theory could spiral out onto more nations. Think about the Baltic states, and in the worst case could spiral out into nuclear war, which comes back to P-Doom, which we discussed on the first episode. And then you have a trade war with China. And it is not only China versus the US in that direct trade relationship that, okay, China is getting all the US consumer money by exporting cheap goods to them and robbing United States corporations of these potential profits. That is not the case. You have to look at it from a larger perspective. China has been able to cement itself as a very relevant player in some Eastern European ports as well. And that has been a stronghold of the United States in the past, or at least these were regions which were not directly opposed to the United States. If now China is able to expand its influence there, and if all of these scenarios about demographic decline and the necessity to act in a parasitic manner from that type of government come into play, that could become very challenging and very dangerous to the United States status as the leading world power. My personal interpretation that if there is a strategy behind it, it is purely geopolitical, and the economics aspect of it is just a means to an end.
First of all, extremely interesting. Thanks for your well structured thoughts. That to me indicates, though, that it is more a set of tactics as opposed to a well thought out long term strategy. Hence, all the memes with regards to playing 4D chess. My feeling is that it is very easy to calculate the impact of certain decisions, certain policies, and certain actions. I almost feel like the global sentiment and movements in the market, or just like the set of events, they feel like a constructed chain of well thought out tactics to me with regards to what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. If you think about certain milestones in this administration, speaking about Trump, there's obviously the midterms, which are coming up in a few months, and a part of me thinks that we are gonna have euphoria and the parabola, and everything will explode the closer we get to the midterms. On the European side, I think we have to do a separate episode, especially all the implications of Russia's actions and what's going on in Ukraine, the funding of the military, and all the packages that have been decided in Europe, especially Germany, in the last couple of weeks. That's worth a separate episode. But just to wrap this one up today on tariffs, what are your closing thoughts on the entire subject?
I don't think this is the point in time where we can come up with closing thoughts because it's still very much in development. The basic theorems that we've outlined in the first episode still hold. We are in an age of volatility. Being short volatility is a very naive trade here. The politics and economic direction of kumbaya and globalism for the sake of itself has likely ended. That is another crucial takeaway. And many of these managed suppressions of volatility we've seen in the past couple of decades in the world are now slinging back and exposing themselves. So don't be short volatility, and do not fall prey to thinking that, yeah, it's just all going to be as it was before. I think the nothing ever happens meme is pretty wrong in the sense that, okay, you are right 49 out of 50 years, but you are wrong when the fifth deviation price impact of the S&P 500 happens. Then you are wrong. The global financial crisis still happened. World War II still happened. World War I still happened. It's not that nothing ever happens. It's that in 364 out of 365 days, nothing ever happens. But on that one day, things do change, and every global order is coming to an end. The things that Ray Dalio has been talking about is worth paying attention to. I'd also highly recommend the latest 1000X podcast. They have an excellent discussion around the tariffs there. I'd also recommend that recent talk by the Singaporean Prime Minister, just to get a feeling for how these different global leaders respond. But other than that, in 48 hours from now, everything could look very differently on the short term end of things. Again, in the mid to long term, there's the possibility of that larger strategy behind this. There's also the possibility that there is no strategy behind it, and that it is all just weird tactics trying to negotiate other deals. The theory that Trump wants to get a Mar-a-Lago Accord, similar to what we've seen with Bretton Woods after World War II, is very reasonable to expect. He has an incentive to try to achieve stuff like getting the Nobel Peace Prize, as Obama did it, and kind of mocked him for that. We can speculate about these mid to long term objectives that these countries and these leaders have. I don't think that they are capable of steering the world as we sometimes imagine. They're also fooled by randomness. They also don't have a complete understanding of all the interconnection. None of us is built to operate in an environment of 8 billion people. We are evolutionarily designed to operate in an environment of 100 to 200 people, not more. And I don't think that is any different for any world leader out there. Of course, they have better access to information. They have a lot of very smart advisors, and they are trying to make sense of all of that and trying to deploy a strategy and approach all of these things with an afterthought. But I don't think that they have a perfect understanding of anything. So after all, be prepared for stuff to change. It is worth paying attention to a lot of the markets right now, to a lot of these developments. It is super tiring, it is super exhausting. But on the other hand, I think the learning curve you have right now, especially if you're in my age, this is your first opportunity to, as a relevant economic actor, live through a potential revision of the global trade order. Maybe experience your first global financial crisis or the biggest financial boom or whatever that is going to end in. Keep paying attention to stuff. I think we'll have to ramp up the frequency of these episodes to keep track of all the new developments.
In other words, keep clicking, don't stop clicking, but be careful what you click on. Max, thank you very much for all the research and all this input. Looking forward to chat again next week.
See you very soon.